Hello everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Some memories lose their shape over time. This one never did. I still remember that night with a level of clarity that unsettles me, not because it was violent or dramatic in the way people usually expect fear to be, but because even now I cannot explain what we heard. Years have passed, but I can still see the living room exactly as it was, still feel the panic rising in my chest, still hear those low voices coming from a part of the house that should have been empty. At the time, I was about 13 years old. I was at that age where you still trust your home automatically because it is familiar, but you are old enough to notice when something changes in the air. A close friend was over at my place and my parents had gone out for the evening. None of that was unusual. They trusted me and there had never been a reason not to. It was supposed to be an easy, forgettable night. Just two kids sitting in a warm house playing video games, wasting time the way kids do when they feel completely safe. That is probably why the memory stayed with me so strongly. It began inside comfort. The house felt normal at first. The lights were on. The TV filled the room with noise and flickering color. We were on the couch with controllers in our hands, talking over the game, laughing, arguing about stupid little things that did not matter. Outside, it was already dark, but that barely registered. Darkness outside does not seem threatening when you are inside your own house, surrounded by familiar walls, with noise and light around you. At that age, safety still felt like something simple. If the door was closed and the lights were on, then nothing could really get to you. At some point during the night, while we were still playing, I heard a loud sound somewhere in the house. It was sharp and heavy, like a large piece of metal hitting something solid. Not a creak, not a settling noise, a real impact. It echoed just enough to make me pause and lift my head for a second. I remember looking vaguely toward the hallway, listening, waiting to see if it would happen again. But when nothing followed it, I shrugged it off. Houses make noises, pipes shift, doors settle. Sometimes things sound bigger at night than they really are. I did what most people do when a strange sound does not immediately repeat itself. I let it go. Looking back now, that was probably the first warning. But at 13, it did not feel like a warning. It felt like background noise. About an hour later, we were no longer really playing. The game was paused and we had drifted into that aimless stage of the night where kids just sit around talking because they do not want the evening to end yet. The room had grown quieter. The TV was still on, frozen on the paused game screen, the kind of stillness that makes small sounds stand out more than usual. We were joking about something stupid, half talking over each other, when I heard something again. This time, it was different. It was not loud. In fact, what struck me first was how easy it would have been to miss. It was subtle enough that my brain did not recognize it right away. I remember feeling myself pause in the middle of listening, not because I knew what I was hearing, but because some part of me understood that it was not a normal house sound. I told my friend to shut up for a second so I could hear better. He kept talking. I snapped at him harder than I meant to, telling him to shut the hell up. The second he went quiet, the sound became clearer. It sounded like whispers, not close, not right behind us, not from outside a window. It was coming from below us, from somewhere under the floor, drifting up through the house in a way that made the room suddenly feel much less safe. It did not sound like one voice either. It sounded like at least two, quiet, tense, almost urgent, like people trying not to be heard while still speaking to each other. I could not make out the words, but I could hear the shape of conversation, the rise and fall of it, the fact that it was human. My whole body went cold. I did not move right away. I did not look at my friend immediately. I just sat there listening, with that terrible feeling spreading through me as the sound settled into something undeniable. It was one thing to hear a bang and dismiss it. It was something else entirely to hear voices coming from a basement that should have been empty. Then I looked at him. I will never forget his face. His eyes were wide and his mouth had gone slightly open, in that way people do when fear arrives before they are ready for it. He looked frozen the same way I felt. And that was the moment everything changed. Until then, there was still a tiny part of me trying to tell myself I had misunderstood the sound, that maybe it was the TV, maybe it was pipes, maybe it was my imagination doing something strange in a quiet house. But the look on his face killed all of that immediately. He heard it too. That realization hit me harder than the whispers themselves. If I had been alone, I might have doubted my own ears. I might have talked myself out of it. But I was not alone, and his fear reflected mine so perfectly that there was no room left for denial. Whatever was making that sound, it was real enough for both of us to hear it. And then my mind jumped back to the metal bang from earlier. The connection formed instantly, and once it did, panic rushed in behind it. My house had an outside metal door that led directly into the basement. The sound I had heard earlier could very easily have been that door being opened or slammed shut. The idea landed all at once, complete and horrifying. Someone had gotten into the basement, more than one person. They were down there now, whispering to each other, maybe trying to decide what to do next. They may be trying to figure out whether anyone was upstairs. Fear took over completely. There was no real discussion, no plan, no attempt to be brave. We did not go to the basement door. We did not call out. We did not try to investigate. We ran. We bolted out the back door as fast as we could. I do not remember putting on shoes. I do not remember grabbing a jacket. I do not remember whether we shut the door behind us. I remember only the feeling of pure panic turning my body into motion. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. My legs felt light and weak at the same time. The whole world narrowed down to one thought, and it was not even in words. It was simply escape. My grandparents lived down the street, close enough that I knew if I ran hard enough, I could reach their house quickly. But that distance felt endless in that moment. Every second of that run felt stretched out by fear. The dark street looked too open. Every shadow seemed dangerous. I kept expecting with absolute terror to hear footsteps behind us, or a voice calling out, or a door opening somewhere. None of that happened, but fear does not need proof once it takes hold. By the time I reached my grandparents' door, I was shaking so badly I could barely knock properly. When they opened it, I could hardly explain what was happening. The words came out fast and tangled. Basement, voices, someone in the house. They did not make me repeat myself or calm down first. They let us in right away, and the second I crossed into their house, the adrenaline started to crash. That was when the fear became heavier. Running had kept me moving. Standing still gave my mind time to picture what might have been down there. I used their phone to call my parents. My voice was unsteady, and I remember trying to sound more coherent than I felt, because saying it out loud made it feel even more serious. I told them about the loud metal sound earlier in the night. I told them we had heard voices coming from the basement. I told them I thought someone had broken into the house. They did not dismiss me. They did not tell me I was imagining things. They told me to stay where I was and said they were coming home immediately. The wait for them felt endless. My friend and I sat there with my grandparents, and every passing minute made my mind work harder against me. I kept hearing the whispers in my head, replaying them over and over, trying to decide if I had imagined certain parts or if they had really sounded that close, that human, that deliberate. Every time a car went past outside, my heart kicked hard in my chest. I pictured people still hiding in the basement, listening, waiting, knowing we had run. When my parents finally got back, they went straight to the house. My friend and I stayed behind with my grandparents. That was probably the right decision, but it made everything feel more helpless. We had no choice except to sit there and wait for an answer. My imagination filled the silence with terrible possibilities. I pictured my parents opening the basement door and finding strangers. I pictured a confrontation. I pictured things I do not even think I fully believed. But fear does not care whether your thoughts are reasonable. Eventually, my parents returned. They said they had searched the whole house, every room, every closet, the basement. They checked everything carefully. There was no one there. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The outside metal basement door was still locked, just as it had always been. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken latch, no open window, no explanation at all. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made the whole night worse. If someone had actually broken in, then at least the fear would have had a shape. There would have been a cause to point to. A danger, yes, but a real and understandable one. The locked basement door took that away. So did the untouched house. So did the complete absence of evidence. All of it turned the experience from a burglary scare into something far more unsettling. Because if no one had been there, then what had we heard? That question stayed with me long after the night ended. It still stays with me now. I know houses make noises. I know old buildings creak, settle, groan, and echo in strange ways. I know sound can travel in confusing directions. I know two scared kids can feed off each other's fear. But even with all of that, there is one detail I can never explain away. We both heard voices, not random noise, not a thump, not a vague sound we interpreted afterward. Voices. Low, urgent, whispering voices from the basement. The fact that my friend heard them too is what keeps this memory pinned in place so firmly. If I had been alone, I would probably have spent years convincing myself it was my imagination. I would have blamed boredom, fear, darkness, anything, but I was not alone. The fear on his face happened at the same time the fear happened in me. We reacted to the same thing. That changed something in me for a long time. After that night, I hated being home alone. Even in daylight, the house felt slightly altered, as if I had seen a hidden side of it that I could no longer ignore. At night, it was worse. Every creak made my stomach tighten. Every dull thump somewhere in the house sent my mind back to that couch, that paused game, that frozen moment when the room went silent and the whispers rose from below. It was not just fear of intruders anymore. It was fear of not understanding what was possible in a place that had once felt completely safe. That, I think, was the part that stayed with me most. Not just the terror itself, but the way it unsettled my trust in ordinary things. A familiar house, a normal evening, a living room filled with light and noise. It all changed within seconds because of a sound that should not have been there. And once something like that happens, the familiar never feels entirely the same again. Even now, years later, I can still picture every part of that scene. The couch, the glow of the TV, the controllers in our hands, the moment I told my friend to be quiet, the silence afterward, the whispering low and urgent, too soft to understand and too clear to deny. And more than anything, I remember looking at him and realizing from his face alone that I was not imagining it. I do not claim to know what it was. I do not have a clean paranormal explanation, and I do not have a rational one that ties everything together in a satisfying way. All I know is that something happened in that house that night, but something real enough to send two 13-year-old boys running out the back door and all the way down the street in blind panic. Maybe there is an explanation buried somewhere in the structure of that house, in the way sound carried in some ordinary thing we never considered. Maybe there is not. But whatever the truth is, the memory never left. Some nights scare you while they are happening and then fade once morning comes. This was not one of those nights. This one stayed. It stayed because there was no answer. It stayed because fear entered a familiar place and never fully left it. And it stayed because even now, after all these years, I can still hear those whispers drifting up from the basement, just out of reach, sounding exactly like something that should not have been there at all. Some places make it easier to believe that old things still linger. I learned that the hard way on a beach in the far north of Scotland, where one ordinary walk with my dog left me with an image I still cannot shake. Even now, when I try to explain it logically, the memory refuses to feel ordinary. It still sits in my mind with the weight of something that meant more than it should have. For the past few years, I have been living along the north coast of the Scottish Highlands, in what is essentially the northernmost town on the British mainland. It is a quiet place shaped by sea wind, cold light, and the kind of weather that can change the mood of an entire day in less than an hour. Life feels slower there, but also more exposed, as if you are living closer to the bare frame of the world. The land and sea are both beautiful, but neither ever lets you forget how small you are. On rough days, when the wind comes in hard from the water and the sky stretches wide and gray above everything, you can feel almost erased by the landscape. One of the most constant parts of my routine is walking my dog, Maisie. Every day, no matter the season, we go down to the beach. It curves around the bay in a long, quiet sweep, and there are stretches where you can walk for quite a while without seeing another person. That was one of the things I loved about it from the start. It felt peaceful in a way that is hard to find anywhere else. There was always the same rhythm to it. The wash of the waves, the gulls overhead, the crunch of damp sand under your boots. Maisie moving ahead of me with her nose close to the ground. After a while, the place became more than familiar. It became a kind of refuge. The view is part of what makes that beach feel so strange and beautiful at the same time. On clear days, when the air is crisp and the sky is open, you can see the islands of Orkney sitting far out on the horizon. They never quite look real from that distance. They seem less like land and more like a faded shape pressed against the edge of the sea, as if they belong half to this world and half to some older one. Knowing that Orkney is filled with ancient Neolithic sites only deepens that feeling. Even if you are not especially mystical by nature, it does something to your imagination. It makes the horizon feel layered, full of history and silence and things long buried but not entirely gone. On other days, the islands vanish completely. Cloud rolls in low or sea fog drifts across the water, and the horizon disappears into one long strip of pale emptiness. On those days, the sea seems endless. There is no line dividing water from sky, no distant land to anchor your eyes. It can be beautiful, but it can also be unsettling. The world feels unfinished when the horizon is gone, as though you are standing at the edge of something wider and older than your mind can comfortably hold. It was on one of those in-between days that this happened. The weather was fairly typical for the area, not clear, not fully closed in either. The sea was calm enough, the sky pale and heavy, the air sharp with salt. There was that faint smell of seaweed and cold water that always seems stronger on northern beaches, especially when the tide has recently gone out. I had let Maisie off her lead because she is usually well behaved and more interested in sniffing through the washed-up seaweed than running too far ahead. She moved in front of me in her usual wandering pattern, weaving through piles of tangled weed left behind by the tide. I was following at a relaxed pace, not thinking about anything in particular, when I saw her stop. It was not the casual stop of a dog distracted by a smell. Her entire body changed at once. She froze, head lowered, tail stiff, all her attention fixed on something in front of her. Then she stepped forward and began pawing at it lightly, nosing around with intense curiosity. I called her name, expecting her to come back. She did not even glance at me. There was something in her posture that made me walk faster without really choosing to. But then I saw what she had found. Lying across the top of one of the larger piles of seaweed was an animal skeleton. At first glance, it startled me badly enough that I stopped in my tracks. The bones were pale and exposed, bleached almost white, with the skull angled slightly upward, in a way that made the teeth look like they were showing. The sight of bones in the open always hits differently than you expect it to. In a field or a wooded place, they seem like part of the landscape, something nature has quietly folded back into itself. But on a beach, laid out on black seaweed in the cold light, they feel abrupt and strangely theatrical, as if they have been placed there to be seen. My first thought was that it must have been a sheep or a goat. The teeth were thick and flat, more like those of a grazing animal than a predator. That would not have been especially strange in itself. There are farms scattered all through the highlands, and across the water in Orkney as well. It was easy enough to imagine an animal falling from a cliff somewhere, or being swept into the sea, drowning and drifting for days before washing ashore. The sea returns things in pieces sometimes. There is nothing supernatural about that. But the longer I looked, the less sense the carcass made. The upper half of the body was completely skeletal. The skull was bare. The rib cage stood open. The spine was exposed and clean, stripped down so completely that it looked almost polished by time and salt water. But the lower half was entirely different. The hind legs were still intact. The hooves remained attached. The fur on the legs was still there too, a dark and wet and clinging close to the shape beneath. It did not look like something that had been reduced over the same period of time as the upper body. It looked fresher, far fresher, as if the front half belonged to one stage of death and the back half to another. That was the detail that kept me standing there long after I should have simply moved on. I remember staring at it, trying to force a sensible explanation into place. If scavengers had picked it clean, why would they stop halfway? If the ocean had broken it down unevenly, why did the contrast look so sharp, almost divided? If the body had only recently washed up, how were the exposed bones already so white and clean? Every answer I reached for seemed possible in theory and wrong in practice. The body looked split between two conditions that should not have existed together. It felt less like ordinary decay and more like something interrupted. Then I noticed the position. It was lying on its back. That should not have mattered, but it did. The spine lay flat against the seaweed, with what looked like one limb extended out on each side. It was not posed, of course. I know that. It was only the result of tide and weight and the way the weed had caught it. But the shape of it hit me instantly in a way I could not control. It looked almost human in posture. Not literally human, but close enough for the mind to recoil. The upper body skeletal, the lower body dark and furred, the legs still intact, the skull raised slightly as if looking upward. The effect was wrong in a way I felt before I fully understood it. The image that came to mind was immediate and unwelcome. It reminded me of Baphomet, that old, unsettling image of a goat-headed figure with a human-like body. I am not somebody who goes around reading signs into every strange thing I see. I am not the kind of person who actively hunts for occult meanings in ordinary life. But the resemblance struck me all the same, and once it did, I could not unsee it. The white skull, the dark legs, the spread of the limbs, the whole shape of it lying there on the seaweed as if arranged by some cruel sense of symbolism. It felt wrong on a level deeper than simple disgust. Maisie, who had been curious at first, backed away. That unsettled me even more. She is usually fearless when it comes to strange smells and dead things washed up by the tide. No, but now she moved closer to me instead of toward the carcass. I cannot say whether she sensed anything unusual or whether she was simply responding to the tension in me. Dogs pick up on our fear very quickly. Still, the fact that she no longer wanted to go near it made the whole moment feel heavier. We stood there together, the wind brushing past us, the sound of the waves behind us, and that thing lying silently in front of us, like some message I had no ability to read. I kept trying to make sense of it. There had to be a natural explanation. I told myself that over and over again. Maybe the upper part had been exposed to the elements far longer than the lower part. Maybe the way it had drifted in the water had protected one half. Maybe scavengers had reached only what was easiest to strip away, and the sea had done the rest. There are countless strange things nature can produce when time, salt, weather, and animals all work on the same body. I knew that. I still know it. But knowledge did not do much in that moment. What I felt standing there was not simple revulsion. It was not only surprise. It was something heavier, a dense unease that settled in my chest and did not leave. It felt disproportionate to what I was actually seeing, which only made it worse. It was as if my mind had already crossed some line and my body was following it, responding not to bones and seaweed, but to the meaning my instincts were building around them. I remember thinking very clearly and very suddenly that it felt like a bad omen. The thought came into my head whole. I did not reason my way toward it. I did not choose it. It simply arrived, cold and immediate. And once it did, it would not leave. I stood there looking at that carcass and felt, with a certainty I could not justify, that I had stumbled across something I was not meant to see. Not because it was supernatural in any obvious sense, but because it carried the emotional weight of a sign, a warning, a symbol, something that had taken an ordinary walk and tilted it slightly out of true. After a moment, I clipped Maisie's lead back on and led her away. I did not want her near it, and I did not want to remain there any longer myself. As we walked on, I kept glancing back over my shoulder. I knew it would look the same every time I looked. It was only a carcass. It would not move. It would not change. And yet I kept checking, half expecting something impossible, half unable to accept that I was leaving it behind. The rest of the walk felt altered. The beach, which normally calmed me, felt colder and somehow less welcoming. The sea no longer sounded soothing. The whole place seemed slightly wrong, as if the balance of the day had shifted and had not yet settled back. In the days that followed, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself I had let the landscape and my own imagination get the better of me. Living in the highlands does that to you sometimes. The place has too much weather, too much history, too much old silence. It makes symbolism feel close at hand. It encourages stories. It invites interpretation. I know that. I know how easy it is to let your mind wander when you live among ancient land, long horizons, and a sea that can erase and return things without explanation. But the image would not leave me. It kept resurfacing at unexpected times. I would be making tea, folding laundry, walking into town, and suddenly I would see it again as clearly as if I were standing on the beach. The white skull, the dark furred legs, the seaweed beneath it, the way the whole body looked divided against itself. Each time the memory returned, it brought that same unease with it, as if the feeling had attached itself to the image permanently. Then, not long after that day, my personal life began to unravel. I will not go into detail because the details belong to people besides me, and some losses are easier to carry quietly than to explain. But things changed quickly and painfully. Stress, grief, and emotional upheaval came one after another, not all at once, but close enough together to leave me feeling as though the ground beneath my life had shifted. It was one of those periods where normality falls away faster than you can adapt to it, and every day seems to bring a new weight. Somewhere in the middle of that, The memory of the carcass returned with full force. The connection my mind made was immediate and deeply unsettling. I thought of the feeling I had on the beach, that uninvited certainty that I was looking at some kind of omen. And once that thought returned, it was hard to shake. I know how irrational that sounds. I know life does not require warnings in order to wound us. Tragedy does not need symbols. Bad things happen because life is full of chance and cruelty and timing we do not control. Rationally, I understand all of that. And yet part of me still thinks back to that day and cannot quite dismiss the feeling. That is the uncomfortable truth of it. I do not believe the beach sent me a message. I do not think the sea arranged a carcass specifically for me. I do not think the world works that neatly, but I cannot deny that standing there, looking at something so strangely divided, so unnaturally striking in appearance, it felt like more than random decay. It felt charged. Whether that charge came from the carcass itself or from something inside me that was already preparing for grief, I cannot say. With time, I have tried to settle on the simplest explanation, that it was a natural occurrence made disturbing only by context and imagination. A dead, grazing animal caught by the tide, a body altered unevenly by scavengers, salt, weather, and drift. A strange sight made stranger by the lonely setting of a highland beach and my own tendency toward superstition. All of that is possible. All of that may even be true. But memory does not always care what is likely. What stays with me is not just what I saw, but how deeply it unsettled me in the moment. The sight of that skull grinning up from the seaweed, the dark, intact legs below it, the way it lay on its back as if arranged for meaning, the way Maisie retreated from it, the way the beach itself seemed to change after I had seen it, becoming colder and more distant, despite looking exactly the same. That kind of unease does not fade simply because you can argue against it later. Even now, when I walk that same stretch of sand, I find myself thinking about it. I look toward the horizon where Orkney sometimes appears and sometimes vanishes, and I remember how quickly an ordinary moment can shift into something that feels loaded with meaning. That is what has stayed with me most. How thin the line really is between the ordinary and the unsettling, between a routine walk and a memory that refuses to become harmless. Maybe it was only an unfortunate animal returned by the sea in a grotesque arrangement of chance. Maybe my mind turned it into a symbol only after later events gave it one. Maybe that is all omens ever are, ordinary things that grief reaches backward and claims. I have considered that possibility many times, and some days I even believe it. But belief is not the same as release. What I saw that day on the beach still feels heavier than it should. It still feels like a moment the world tilted slightly, just enough for me to notice. And when I remember the white skull, the dark furred legs, and the way the carcass lay there on the seaweed, as if it had been placed rather than washed ashore, I feel the same cold unease I felt then. Not because I know it meant something, but because I still cannot be sure that it meant nothing. That is what lingers. Not certainty, not explanation. Just the feeling that on one ordinary walk along a familiar beach in the far north of Scotland, I came across something that looked too symbolic to ignore and too natural to prove. Something that sat perfectly on the line between explanation and dread, and has remained there ever since. When my father told me this story, he did it in the quiet way people speak when they are handling something fragile. He was careful from the beginning. Before he even got to the strange part, he asked me not to repeat the names of the people involved and not to identify the place where it happened. He did not sound embarrassed. He sounded protective, like the memory itself had edges he did not want touched carelessly. That alone stayed with me. Most people, when they tell a strange story from childhood, either laugh about it or lean into it. My father did neither. He spoke like a man opening a locked box he had kept shut for years. He said he had been around 12 years old at the time. He and a close friend had gone down to a nearby river to fish, something they had done many times before. It was an ordinary part of life where he grew up. The river was familiar to them in the way places from childhood often are, known so well that they stop feeling wild. There was a wooden dock there, a slow-moving current, and a stretch of sandy shore where kids could walk around while they waited for a bite. It was the kind of place adults trusted because nothing bad had ever happened there. The kind of place children begin to think belongs to them. That day had started like any other. They brought their rods, their bait, and whatever else boys that age thought they needed for a simple afternoon by the water. They baited the hooks, cast their lines, and secured the rods by chaining them to the dock so the poles would not be dragged in if something bit hard. He told me this detail more than once, which made me think it mattered to him. Not because it was unusual, but because it proved they had set things up properly. They were not being reckless. They were not half paying attention. They knew enough about fishing to respect the equipment and the river, and that mattered to him because he had spent years trying to understand whether anything ordinary could explain what came next. Once the lines were out, they wandered away from the dock and onto the sandy shore. They were boys, and boys get bored quickly, even when they are doing exactly what they wanted to do. He said they started joking around the way kids do when they have time to fill and nothing to answer to but the sun moving overhead. Somewhere in all that boredom and joking, one of them made a remark about wishing for more fish. That led to another joke, then another, until the two of them were doing what he later called some kind of fake summoning ritual. He made a point of telling me they did not believe in any of it. They scratched shapes in the sand with sticks and shoes, rough little symbols that probably meant nothing, just copies of things they had seen in movies or comics or heard older kids talk about. They stood over those marks and pretended to chant. They laughed while they did it. There was no seriousness in it, no sense that they were crossing a line. It was a joke, nothing more. Two boys near a river trying to make an ordinary afternoon feel interesting. Then the first fishing rod jerked. He said the change was instant. 1 second they were laughing, and the next they were both turned toward the dock, all humor gone from their faces. The rod did not bend the way a fish usually bends a rod. It did not twitch or bounce or pull in little bursts. It was yanked. The line snapped tight so suddenly that there was not even time to run back and grab it. Before they could move, the hook was ripped out and the line snapped clean. At first, they just stared. Any fisherman, even a kid, knows that a strong fish can fight hard. My father knew that then, and he knows it now. He had seen fish pull. He had seen water break, seen the fast, messy struggle that comes when something strong takes the bait. He said, this was not that. The force was too sudden and too direct, like the line had been seized by something with no hesitation at all. Before either of them could fully react, the second rod went the same way. He said whatever had taken the first hook seemed to move upstream, against the current, and grab the second line. That line snapped too. It all happened in seconds. No splashing, no violent disturbance on the surface, no long fight. Just two strong, impossible pulls, one after the other, and then nothing. That was the part he always came back to when he tried to explain why the memory stayed with him. The water did not match what had happened. If a large fish had struck with enough force to snap the line, the river should have shown it. There should have been some sign: thrashing water, ripples spreading out, a dark shape rolling near the surface. Even if they had only caught a glimpse, there should have been something for the eye to hold on to. Instead, the surface remained strangely calm. He said the river looked almost insultingly normal, as if it had swallowed the event without even acknowledging it. The two boys stood there staring into the water. waiting for sense to arrive. They expected something to rise. A huge fish, maybe. A branch dragged under tension. Some natural explanation that had not been obvious in the first second of shock. But the river stayed quiet. The current moved the way it always did. The dock creaked softly. The light on the water did not change. Nothing rose. Nothing revealed itself. If not for the two snapped lines, it would have been easy to believe they had imagined it. He told me they tried to explain it to themselves, even then. That part felt important too. They did not instantly decide it had been supernatural. They were not children primed to believe every odd thing was a ghost or demon or curse. They were trying to be sensible. Maybe it was a giant fish. Maybe both lines had weakened earlier and snapped at the worst possible time. Maybe the current had caught something below the surface that they could not see. They reached for every explanation they could, but fear had already entered the moment. He said what frightened them was not only the strength of the pulls, it was the wrongness of them. The movement did not look like a fish fighting. It looked deliberate, clean, fast, almost as if the lines had been taken by something that knew exactly where they were. And the fact that it seemed to move upstream without disturbing the surface made the whole thing feel less like a hidden animal and more like a hole in the rules they had always trusted. They did not joke anymore after that. They did not recast the lines. They did not argue or dare each other to stay. They simply gathered what they could and left. He said they walked home quickly without speaking much, both of them glancing back more than once, not because they had seen something following them, but because they felt watched. That detail struck me because it was so familiar. Fear often arrives before there is anything visible to fear. Sometimes it comes from a place too old and deep to explain. A child feels it in the body first. The body knows when something ordinary has gone wrong. Years passed after that. My father grew up. So did his friend. They lived full lives. They had jobs, families, all the ordinary weight of adulthood. But he said that day at the river never really left either of them. They talked about it now and then over the years, usually in the same way people return to a wound they cannot stop touching. And not because they enjoy the mystery, but because they want so badly to solve it. Every time they revisited it, they tried again to make it fit into logic, and every time it slid back out. He told me they remained certain that whatever took those hooks was not natural. I remember the way he said that. Not dramatic, not excited, just certain. The kind of certainty that does not come from wanting to believe in something strange, but from having spent too long trying not to. By then, just hearing him say, it had already unsettled me. The story had a quiet force to it. Not because it was loud or theatrical, but because he was not the kind of man to dress up a memory. He was practical by nature, careful. If anything, he disliked giving mystery more room than it deserved. Yet there he was, speaking in a low voice about something from childhood that had never loosened its grip on him. When he finally told me this story, we were staying together in a room, just the two of us. It was late enough that the rest of the world had gone quiet. The conversation had not started with anything unusual. We had simply been talking, the way people sometimes do at night, when they are tired enough to drift into older memories. He did not present the story as some great family secret. He brought it up almost reluctantly, like a thought he had pushed away too many times and had finally decided to let out. As he talked, I could tell he was seeing it again. His eyes kept going distant in that way people's eyes do when the room in front of them is no longer the room they are really in. He chose his words carefully. He described the dock, the sandy bank, the rods chained to the wood. He described the boys laughing over a fake ritual, then stopping when the first line snapped. He described the water staying calm. He did not rush. He did not try to scare me. If anything, the plainness of his telling made it worse. Then, partway through the story, the smell appeared. It came all at once. 1 second the room was normal, and the next, it was full of a foul odor so strong and sudden that both of us stopped speaking. It smelled like feces mixed with sulfur, rotten and sharp at the same time, heavy enough that it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat. My immediate response was practical. I assumed there had to be some ordinary source. A bathroom problem, something outside, some hidden trash, something dead in a vent. The human mind wants causes it can point to. But the smell did not behave like a normal smell. That was the part I can never explain away, no matter how many times I try. If a smell comes from a source, it has a center. It is stronger in one place and weaker in another. It settles into the room according to the air. This did not. We moved around trying to locate it, and it seemed to move too. We checked the bathroom first. Nothing. We checked near the door, near the vent, near our bags, near our shoes. Each time we thought it might be stronger in one place, it shifted again, as if it were floating through the room with intention rather than drifting naturally. We kept looking because that felt better than standing still. The longer it stayed, the more uneasy the room became. It was not only the smell itself, though that was bad enough. It was what it did to the atmosphere. The room began to feel occupied in a way I cannot describe, without sounding foolish. Not full, not crowded, just wrong. As if something had entered that did not need a body to be there. The air felt thick, and every small sound became too noticeable. Our breathing, the scrape of a shoe, the quiet hum from somewhere in the wall. I remember not wanting to turn my back on any part of the room for long, though there was nothing visible to watch. My father had been calm while telling the story, but now he went quiet in a different way. Not thoughtful, alert. He was not especially religious at that stage of his life. He believed in God, but he was not someone who spoke constantly about prayer or signs or evil presences. If anything, he tended to keep faith private. That is why what he did next affected me so deeply. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He simply said he was going to pray. Then he began reciting prayers from the Bible that he still remembered. His voice was steady but serious in a way that changed the whole feeling of the room. I stood there listening, half embarrassed by my own fear, half relieved that he was doing something at all. Part of me expected nothing to happen. Another part of me was afraid something would. I watched the corners of the room without knowing why. I watched the door. I watched the bathroom entrance. The smell remained thick enough to make my eyes water. Then it vanished. Not slowly. Not in the ordinary way odors fade with time and airflow. There was no weakening, no gradual relief. One moment it was there, oppressive and unmistakable, and the next it was gone so completely that the absence itself felt shocking. The air returned to normal, as if someone had opened a hidden door and pulled the smell out all at once. We stood there in silence, both of us registering the same impossible thing. A second earlier, the room had been foul and close. Now it smelled like nothing at all. We checked again, because what else do you do after something like that? We looked around the room a final time, slower now, almost carefully, as if we might still find some ordinary source and wake up from the strangeness of the moment. But there was nothing. No spill, no plumbing issue, no open window carrying in some outside odor, nothing that explained why the smell had arrived. As he told the story, drifted around the room without settling, and then disappeared the moment he began to pray. After that, my father did not say much. He looked shaken, but not in a dramatic way. He looked as if something old had just stood up inside his memory and confirmed that it had never been as far away as he wanted to believe. It was not the expression of a man enjoying a mystery. It was the expression of a man who had hoped, deep down, that time had turned something strange into nothing more than a story. Instead, the story had reached into the room with us. That night stayed with me long after it ended. I have gone over it many times since then, trying to be reasonable. I have considered hidden sources for the smell, some missed detail in the room, some trick of plumbing or airflow we failed to identify. I have tried to think of the childhood story in natural terms too. Large fish can break lines. Strange things happen on rivers. Memory can sharpen some details and blur others. Fear can make coincidence feel meaningful. I know all of that. I have told myself all of that. But none of those explanations fully settle what I saw. What troubles me most is not any single detail by itself. A snapped line can be explained. A bad smell can be explained. A child's memory can be doubted. But this story never sits in one piece. It builds pressure from the way the parts lean against each other. Two boys joking in a familiar place. The fake ritual. The sudden violent pull. The calm water. The decades of certainty that it was not natural. Then, years later, a room turning foul while the memory is spoken aloud and clearing only when prayer begins. Each piece by itself can be argued with. Together they leave behind something harder to dismiss. And maybe that is what has always haunted my father more than the event itself. Not proof, not certainty, just the feeling that something answered. When I think about it now, I do not picture monsters or shadows rising from the river. What I picture is worse in a quieter way. I picture a calm surface that reveals nothing. I picture two boys standing on a sandy bank, waiting for some visible cause to break the spell of what just happened. I picture their laughter dying too quickly. I picture them walking home faster than usual, not wanting to say aloud what each of them already felt. And then I picture my father many years later, grown old enough to think the story has become harmless, only to have the room itself shift while he tells it. That is what makes it linger. Ordinary places are unsettling enough when you realize they may not be ordinary all the time. A river you have fished since childhood. A dock you trusted. A room where nothing should happen except conversation. There is a special kind of fear in having the familiar turn strange without changing shape. Nothing dramatic has to appear. The water can stay smooth. The room can stay empty. The world does not need to show you a face. Sometimes it is enough for it to answer once and then go quiet again. I still do not know what happened at that river. I do not know what snapped those lines or moved against the current without disturbing the surface. I do not know why that smell came into the room while he was telling me the story, or why it vanished so completely after prayer. I cannot prove any part of it. I cannot explain it in a way that satisfies me. All I know is that my father believed what happened to him, and when I saw what happened while he spoke, the belief stopped feeling like something simple. Even now, when I think of the story, I do not think first of the smell or even the broken lines. I think of the silence afterward, the silence on the river after the second line snapped, the silence in the room after the odor vanished. In both moments, what frightened me most was not what appeared, but what refused to reveal itself. Something happened. That much feels undeniable. Then it withdrew, leaving behind no shape, no evidence, only the weight of having been noticed. And that, more than anything, is what stays with me. The possibility that two boys once mocked something they did not believe in, and something in the quiet of that ordinary river responded. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough to leave a mark that lasted the rest of my father's life. And enough to make me wonder how many strange things pass through the world without ever needing to show themselves. About 10 years ago, I had an experience on a dam in southern Idaho that still does not sit right inside me. I can tell the story from beginning to end, and the facts stay mostly the same, but the feeling of it has never stopped shifting. Some memories feel distant with time, like they belong to another version of your life. This one never did. It still feels close. It still feels like something unfinished, something I only escaped in the physical sense. The rest of it stayed with me. I was driving with a close friend that day, crossing a long dam locals used all the time. It stretched for about 2 miles, straight and exposed, with water on both sides and hardly any room to pull over safely. It was not a hidden road or some empty place where nobody ever went. People ran there, people fished there. Families parked and stood at the rails to look out over the water. Teenagers swam there in warmer weather. Because of that, there was nothing immediately strange about seeing a woman jogging ahead of us. At first, she was only part of the landscape, another person using the road like everyone else. Then I noticed which side she was on. The shoulder on that side was narrow, barely there in places, and every car that passed her did so too closely for comfort. It made no sense to run there when the other side gave you more space. I remember looking at her and having one of those small, passing thoughts that barely seems important at the time. Maybe she didn't know the road well. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe she planned to cross over in a minute. None of those thoughts lasted long. As we got closer, I saw the way she moved, and all of them fell apart. She was crying. Not the kind of crying people try to hide in public. Not the quiet kind. She was fully crying, her face twisted with it, her body tight and frantic. She kept moving forward, but there was no rhythm to it, no steady pace like someone out for exercise. Her arms jerked instead of swung. Her shoulders were pulled up high with tension. Twice she looked back over her shoulder, fast and sharp, and there was something in that glance that made my skin go cold. Fear has a look to it when it is real. It strips the face down. It makes every movement seem borrowed from panic. I slowed the car without thinking much about it. My friend noticed too. I could feel her attention sharpen beside me. Neither of us said anything at first. It happened too quickly for conversation. 1 second we were looking at a crying woman on the side of the dam, trying to understand what was wrong. The next second she turned and ran straight in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes so hard the whole Mazda jolted. She hit the hood with a sound I still remember, a heavy, ugly thud that did not seem possible until it happened. Then she was screaming at me to stop, though I already had. My chest felt hollow for a second, like the air had been knocked out of me with the brakes. My hands locked around the wheel. I had not even fully processed that she had jumped in front of us before she was moving again. She ran to the passenger side. She yanked the door open with both hands and climbed in before either of us could react. I was driving an old 1990 Mazda then, a low 2-door car with almost no extra room. There was nowhere for her to go except half on top of my friend, twisting herself into the passenger seat like somebody trying to get out of the rain, except this was not rain. This was terror. She kept saying the same thing over and over, louder each time. Drive, please drive, go, just go. There are moments when your mind does not reason its way forward. It obeys whatever feels most urgent. I put the car in gear and drove. My friend was pinned awkwardly against the seat and the door, still trying to make space for her even while asking if she was okay. I was asking where she needed to go, whether someone was after her, whether she was hurt. At first, the woman could not answer. Her breathing was too fast. She kept looking out the back window, then pressing a hand over her mouth as if she were trying to hold herself together. That was when I noticed her shirt. It was white, or had been, but parts of it were stained with blood. The sight of it changed everything. Until then, part of me was still trying to fit what was happening into some misunderstanding, some explanation that did not involve real violence. The blood ended that. It was not a little smear either. There were several patches of it, enough that I felt my stomach sink hard. My friend saw it too and went quiet for a second. the kind of silence that comes when shock finally catches up. The woman wiped at her face with the back of her hand and tried to speak. Her words came out broken at first, tripping over her breathing. She said she had jumped out of a moving car. She said her boyfriend had been beating her. Then she said the part that stayed with me most. Their kids were still with him. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter after that. My hands were already tense, but now they hurt. My thoughts were racing in so many directions that I could not hold on to any one of them for long. A man hitting her, children still in the car, blood on her shirt. The fact that she had thrown herself in front of a stranger's moving vehicle because that had seemed safer than what she had left behind. It did not feel like something from real life. It felt too sudden, too sharp, like we had driven into the middle of a nightmare already in progress. We asked if she wanted us to call the police. She shook her head hard. We asked if she had family nearby. She said, "Just get me to the closest town." It was about 15 minutes away. Her voice trembled when she said it, but there was a kind of desperate focus in it too. And not the voice of somebody making a plan. The voice of somebody trying to reach the next safe place before something caught up to her. So I kept driving. The strangest part of fear is how it changes the air around ordinary things. The road was still the same road. The water was still on both sides. The sun was still high. But the inside of the car had changed completely. Every sound stood out. The engine, the tires, her breathing, my friend's voice whenever she asked another question. Even the small rustle of fabric when the woman shifted felt too loud. She kept turning to look behind us. Every time she did, I checked the mirror too, though I did not know exactly what I expected to see. When we reached the end of the dam, where the road widened a little and the land began to rise, she said she wanted to move into the back seat so she could make some calls. In a bigger car that would have been easy. In my Mazda, it meant stopping, folding the seat forward and letting her squeeze herself into the back. I hated stopping even for a moment. The whole time I was doing it, I had the sick feeling that we were exposed. But she seemed desperate to get away from the front window, desperate to make herself smaller somehow, less visible. So we stopped just long enough for her to climb through, and then I pulled back onto the road. We had barely started moving again when she screamed. Not loudly at first. It was more like a strangled burst of panic. Then she said, "He turned around." I looked in the rearview mirror. Far back across the dam, a car was coming toward us at a speed that instantly felt wrong. Even at that distance, it looked aggressive, not fast in the normal way people drive fast on open roads, fast with purpose, fast like it had chosen us. The woman in the back seat was crying harder now, one hand braced against the side window, her whole body bent forward as if she could somehow see danger more clearly by leaning toward it. She kept saying, "It was him." My friend twisted around in her seat to look, then turned back toward me with a face I will never forget. She did not have to say anything. I already knew. I pressed down harder on the gas. The road gave us nowhere to go. That was the worst of it. The dam had felt open before. Now it felt like a trap. There were no trees to turn into, no side roads, no buildings, no place to disappear. Just a straight stretch behind us and another one ahead. The kind of road where anyone can watch anyone for a long time. I remember thinking that the water on both sides made it feel even more wrong, like we were driving across something too narrow and too exposed to survive fear on. The car behind us gained on us faster than I thought it could. For a few seconds I tried to tell myself, maybe it was not him. Maybe it was just another driver in a hurry, but that hope did not last. The woman in the back knew before I did. Some part of her had probably spent a long time learning the sound and shape of danger. She knew his car. She knew what it looked like when it came after her. By the time I could make out more of it in the mirror, I was already certain. He came up on us fast and stayed there, tight on our rear bumper, I was heading toward a fairly large hill at that point, and my speed climbed higher than I was comfortable with. The old Mazda was not built to feel safe at those speeds. It rattled in a way that made me too aware of its age. My hands were slick on the wheel. My heart was pounding so hard that it almost seemed to interfere with my hearing. My friend kept saying, "Oh my God," under her breath, like she was trying not to let the woman in the back hear just how frightened she was. Then he pulled out to pass me. There was oncoming traffic coming downhill toward us. For a second, every part of me locked. He stayed in that lane longer than any sane person would have. I could see the oncoming vehicle, and still he kept pushing forward, as if nothing existed except getting around us. Then, at the last possible second, he swerved back behind me. My friend shouted. The woman in the back made a broken, choking sound. I felt that cold, helpless shock spread through me. The awful knowledge that if he caused a crash out there would be nowhere to go and no time to fix anything. We reached the top of the hill and he tried again. By then, I was going over 80 miles an hour, faster than I had ever driven on that road, and faster than I wanted to be driving anywhere in that car. It no longer felt like driving in the normal sense. It felt like trying to keep ahead of a decision somebody else had made. A violent person behind us. Open road ahead. Other people on the road who had no idea what was happening. I was terrified of him, but I was also terrified of becoming the thing that killed somebody else by trying to outrun him. Then he shot past us. He cut in front of me and slammed on his brakes so hard I barely had time to react. I jerked the wheel and felt the tires hit loose gravel at the edge of the road. The Mazda fishtailed. For 1 second, I thought we were going to roll or hit his car or slide into the ditch. The world seemed to lurch sideways. Then the car came to a stop at an angle, half off the road. The engine still running, every one of us frozen in the shock of not having crashed. The silence that followed lasted maybe half a second, but I still remember it. Then his door flew open. He came out screaming. He pointed at the woman in the back seat and demanded that she come get her kids. His voice was full of rage. But there was something worse than rage in it too. Possession. Certainty. He did not look embarrassed that strangers had witnessed any of this. He did not look hesitant or ashamed. He looked furious that she had gotten away from him, even for a few minutes. That was one of the things that unsettled me most later. He behaved like we were the problem, like we had interrupted something that belonged to him. The woman started crying again, harder than before. I turned in my seat and told her not to get out. My friend did the same. We said we would drive, we would call the police, we would help her. But then she looked toward his car, and I followed her eyes. I could not clearly see the children from where I was, but I saw enough movement in the back seat to know they were there. Everything changed in her face then. Until that moment, all of her fear had been pointed in one direction, away from him. Now it split in two. She opened the door. I remember saying, "Wait, don't," and hearing my own voice sound thin and useless. She got out anyway. She moved quickly, stumbling once on the uneven edge of the road, then hurried to his car and opened the back door. The way she wrapped her arms around those children is something I still see clearly. She clung to them with all the force of somebody who had been holding herself together by one final thought. They were not abstract children in a story then. They were real, small bodies in a back seat, and she held them like she was afraid they might be taken from her the second she loosened her grip. The man turned and screamed at us to drive off. I asked her if she wanted us to stay. I asked if she was okay. It was a stupid question, and I knew it even as I said it, but my mind was slipping. Too much was happening too fast. She looked back at us with tears still on her face and begged us to leave. She said not to call the police. Then she made a motion with one hand, urgent and shaky, telling us to go. We did not know what else to do. I hated leaving. I still hate that part when I replay it. But in that moment we were young, frightened and badly shaken. A violent man had chased us at high speed, forced us off the road and was standing yards away screaming. The woman herself was begging us to go. We were not thinking clearly anymore. Fear had narrowed everything down to the next second and the next. So I pulled the car back onto the road and drove away. My entire body was trembling. Neither of us spoke for a while. My friend kept looking back until the other car disappeared from view. Then she faced forward and sat very still. The silence inside the Mazda felt heavier than any conversation could have. My hands would not stop shaking on the wheel. I could still hear his voice. I could still see the blood on her shirt. I could still feel the moment the tires had slipped on gravel, and the car had nearly gone out from under me. After about a mile, I pulled into a local farmhouse because I could not keep driving like that. I needed to stop. I needed to breathe somewhere that was not that road. We went inside and called the police. We gave our statements as carefully as we could, describing the woman, the man, the cars, the blood, the chase, the direction they had gone. I remember feeling frustrated by how broken my own memory already seemed. Certain details were painfully clear. Others felt smeared at the edges, as if the whole thing had happened too fast for my mind to hold on to every part of it. The officer listened carefully and thanked us. After that, we never heard anything else. No update, no confirmation, no answer. We never found out whether they located the car. We never found out whether she and the children got away from him later. We never found out whether that moment by the side of the road was the start of something better or just one more terrible piece of a much longer life. That uncertainty is what stayed with me the most. Fear passes, at least partly. Shock softens, but uncertainty does something different. It keeps the event alive. It leaves it open. For a long time after that, I would think about little details when I least expected it. A white shirt in a store, and suddenly I would remember the blood on hers. A woman jogging along a roadside, and I would feel my chest tighten before I even understood why. A car coming up too fast behind me, and all at once, I would be back on that dam, checking the mirror again, feeling the old helplessness crawl back over me. The memory did not live in one place. It scattered itself through ordinary life. What disturbed me most was not only the violence, it was the way the whole thing entered our day without warning. No dark house, no storm, no middle of the night. It happened under open sky, in broad daylight, in a place people used for fishing and walking and enjoying the view. The horror was not hidden. It was right there among normal things, and that somehow made it worse. It made the world feel less stable. It made me realize how close ordinary life always is to something desperate and brutal happening just out of sight. Before that day, domestic violence had felt real in the distant way. Many terrible things feel real. You know it exists. You hear about it. You think of it as something awful that happens somewhere else to other people. Inside closed homes you will never see. After that day, it stopped being distant. It had a face, a voice, blood on cotton, children in a back seat, and a man wild with rage on the side of a road. It forced itself into my life for a matter of minutes, and those minutes changed the way I understood fear. I still think about the woman sometimes, especially the look in her eyes when she first jumped into the car. There was something in that look deeper than panic. It was the look of a person who had reached the end of what she could bear and still had not found safety. I think about how she kept checking behind us, how she wanted the back seat, how she knew he had turned around before I could even make out the car. I think about what her life must have already been for all those instincts to be so sharp. And I think about the children. I think about how quickly she ran to them despite everything. I think about the way she held them. I think about how many impossible choices can exist inside a single moment. From the outside, people like to imagine there is always one right decision. one clear path a person should take. But fear does not work like that. Love does not work like that either. Standing there, she was not choosing between good and bad. She was choosing inside a trap. Even now, years later, when I return to that memory, what unsettles me most is how close everything came to becoming even worse. We could have hit her when she jumped in front of the car. He could have caused a head-on collision on that hill. We could have rolled when he forced us off the road. Another family could have been caught in the middle of it. There are too many ways that day could have ended in death, and the fact that it did not does not make it easier to carry. In some ways it makes it harder because survival left room for questions instead of ending them. I still hope she and her children found safety. I still hope that somewhere after we lost sight of them, the story changed direction. But hope is quiet when it has nothing solid to hold on to. What remains stronger is the memory itself, fixed in sharp pieces. The narrow shoulder, the sound of her hitting the hood, the blood, the mirror, the car gaining on us, the hill, the brakes, the children, her hand motioning for us to leave. Some experiences fade into the past and stay there. This one never did. It lives in me like a held breath that was never fully released. And every time I think about that long stretch of road over the water, I remember how quickly a normal day can split open and reveal something terrible already moving toward you. Before I was born, something happened in the house where I would later spend my childhood. And for years I carried that story around like a memory I had somehow inherited instead of lived. My mother told it so often and always in the same quiet tone that it settled into me early. By the time I was old enough to understand what fear was, I already knew there had once been an old man at the door, or at least that someone had seen one there. The story never came with shouting or dramatic pauses. That was part of what made it stay with me. It was told the way people talk about ordinary things they still cannot explain. And that kind of calm can make a strange thing feel more possible than any ghost story meant to entertain. My mother was young then, but still young enough to spend whole afternoons playing games on the floor with my little cousin. He was only 2 or 3 at the time, barely old enough to form clear sentences, and they were doing something simple in the front room. She always said she could not remember exactly what they were throwing back and forth. Some small object, maybe a soft toy, maybe a ball, maybe something from a child's game that no one would have bothered remembering if the afternoon had stayed normal. The windows were shut. The house was quiet. It was the kind of daylight that makes a home feel sealed off from trouble. The carpet held the warm smell of sun from the front window. Somewhere in the kitchen there was the faint, stale scent of tea and washing up liquid. Nothing about it suggested that years later we would still be talking about those few minutes. Well, at one point she tossed the object down the hallway or toward the front of the house, and my cousin ran after it. He was gone only for a moment. She said there was just enough time for her to expect him to come toddling back, proud of himself, before she heard him scream. Not cry, not call out, scream. That distinction mattered to her, even after all those years. She had heard children cry for attention, cry over falls, cry because they were startled or tired. This was different. It was a raw, panicked sound that made her body move before her mind caught up. He came stumbling back toward her, red-faced and shaking, breath breaking in his chest, reaching out with both arms. She scooped him up immediately. He clung to her so hard she said it almost hurt. She kept asking him what was wrong, what happened, what had scared him. At first, he could only sob against her shoulder. Then, in the broken way little children speak when they are terrified, he told her there was an old man standing at the door. She did what most people say they would do in a story like this, but fewer people probably would in life. She went straight to look. Still holding him against her, she walked to the front door and opened it wide, expecting at the very least to catch sight of someone stepping away or hear a gate or see a shadow moving along the road. But outside, there was nothing. No visitor, no stranger, no one on the path, no sound of footsteps fading. The street sat in that flat daytime silence familiar neighborhoods can have, where every parked car and front garden seems to be holding its breath. She checked the step and looked both ways. She glanced around the side of the house. She even stood there longer than she needed to, as if an explanation might still appear if she gave it another few seconds. But there was only the ordinary world waiting for her, and behind her, the child in her arms still trembling with a fear too intense to fake. She told herself what anyone sensible would tell themselves. A shadow, a coat hanging in the wrong place, a child's imagination, a face found inside a pattern where no face existed. But she said the look on his face would not leave her. He had not looked confused. He had looked as though he had seen someone who should not have been there. That evening she told my father. She expected him to laugh, or at least to gently dismiss it. My mother was never the kind of person who enjoyed spooky stories, and my father knew that. She was not telling it for effect. She only wanted him to say what husbands usually say in those moments, that children see strange things sometimes, that there was nothing to worry about, that the mind can turn a doorway into a person when the light falls badly. Instead, he went quiet. That was the part she always repeated most carefully. Not what he said first, but the pause before it. He had gone still in a way that made her feel foolish and frightened at once, as if she had put a private thought into the room by accident. Then he told her he thought he had seen an old man too. Not in the house exactly, not standing in a doorway, just for a moment the day before, in the mirror. That was what he said. He had caught sight of someone old where only his own reflection should have been. He tried to laugh as soon as he heard himself saying it. He brushed it away almost immediately, claiming he had turned too fast, that the light had been odd, that he had mistaken his own face at an angle and frightened himself for no reason. But by then the damage had already been done. He had not denied it. He had only rushed to contain it. My mother never believed the joke that followed. The first reaction is usually the true one. That was what she told me years later, not because she wanted me to believe in anything, but because she wanted me to understand why the memory stayed with her. If my cousin had been the only one, she could have forgotten it. If my father had laughed at once, she could have folded the whole thing up and placed it somewhere harmless. But both of them in different ways, I had reached for the same image. An old man where no old man should have been. Time passed. I was born. The house became simply our house. It held all the normal things childhood homes hold. Damp shoes by the door, winter condensation on the windows, arguments from the kitchen, school bags dropped in the hall, the television muttering in one room while someone washed dishes in another. It never felt like the kind of place a story should gather around. No doors slammed on their own. No voices floated through the night. No one spoke in whispers about cold spots or footsteps upstairs. If the house carried anything strange, it carried it quietly. That might be why the story about the old man stayed interesting but distant for most of my childhood. It belonged to a time before me. I could picture it, but I did not feel threatened by it. The house remained what houses usually are to children, the center of life, too familiar to look at closely. If there were moments that felt odd, they were small enough to ignore. A feeling of being watched from the hallway that vanished when I looked. The mirror in one room reflecting the light in a way I disliked. The brief discomfort of entering a quiet space and sensing just for a second that I had interrupted something. Children accept such things because they have little choice. They keep living around them until the feeling passes. Years later, when I was around 13 and my sister was about 10, we went riding our bikes through the woods beside our house. Those woods were woven into our childhood so tightly that I still struggle to think of one without the other. We knew the tracks and muddy turns. We knew where the path widened and where it narrowed. We knew which parts stayed bright even late in the day, and which parts seemed darker than they should have, even under a clear sky. We had ridden there so often that familiarity itself had become a kind of permission. The woods were not wild in our minds. They were just nearby. That day was not memorable at first. It was one of those ordinary afternoons that blend into 100 others when you are young. The air had that earthy smell woods get when the ground has held moisture for days. Our tires broke sticks and pressed into soft patches of soil. Somewhere overhead, birds kept making short, restless sounds. We were not talking about anything important. We were just riding. We went farther in than usual, though not so far that it felt brave. There was a path we took often enough to trust, and it led into a quieter stretch where the trees stood thicker and the outside world dropped away. The sounds of roads disappeared first. Then the sense of direction blurred. In woods like that, space becomes strange. Everything looks passable until you imagine leaving the path. Then suddenly the trees seem to close ranks. At one bend there was a bench. I remember it clearly because it looked wrong there, not broken or dirty, just misplaced. It was not set where walkers would normally stop. There was no scenic opening, no view worth sitting for, no nearby road or signpost. It stood in a patch of woods that offered only more woods. Even then, before anything else happened, I felt the oddness of it. A bench suggests intention. It means someone chose that exact spot and thought, yes, here. But there was nothing there to explain the choice. An old man sat on it. He was drawing. That is the detail that has never softened with time. He was not reading or resting or staring ahead. He had a sketchbook or pad balanced before him, and he seemed absorbed in it. His stillness struck me first. We were two children on bikes approaching along a rough path, making enough noise to be noticed, and yet he did not startle or look up in irritation. He remained bent slightly over the page with a calm so complete it felt separate from the rest of the afternoon. He did not seem threatening. If anything, he appeared settled in a way that made us look temporary by comparison, as if we were the ones passing through a place that belonged to him. Then my sister fell. It happened close enough to the bench that I have never been able to separate the two things in my mind. Her front wheel jerked or hit a rut or slid on something hidden under leaves. I am no longer sure. What I do remember is how hard she went down and how instantly wrong her reaction felt. Children fall off bikes all the time. There is the shock, then the pain, then anger or tears. But she did not react as though she had only hurt herself. She reacted like someone trying to get away. She hit the ground and began crying at once, not in outrage, but in panic. She scrambled up before I could reach her. One shoe came half off. Her bike was twisted under her, but she did not try to pull it free. She looked toward home, not toward me. Then she ran. She ran without her bike. She ran without speaking. She ran in a blind, stumbling way that made no sense unless something inside her had already decided that stopping was dangerous. I shouted after her. She did not turn around. Within seconds, the trees had swallowed her. For a moment, I was too annoyed to be frightened. I thought she was overreacting. I leaned my bike down and went to untangle hers, muttering to myself, irritated, that I would now have to wheel both back. Her shoe lay off to one side. The path smelled of crushed leaves and that sharp green scent that rises when stems break. Somewhere close by, a fly buzzed and settled again. I remember all of this because of what was not happening. The old man still did not react. A child had fallen hard, almost at his feet, and then fled in obvious distress, and he remained on the bench, drawing, with a composure that now feels less peaceful in memory than unnatural. At the time, I only thought he was strange. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not glance after her. He did not even offer that small, polite look strangers usually give when something awkward happens nearby. It was as though he existed in a bubble just outside normal human response. I looked at him more directly then. I wanted some sign that he had seen what I had seen. I do not remember his face in perfect detail, and that troubles me more now than it did then. I remember age. I remember stillness. I remember the sense of a lined face bent over paper, of pale hands that moved little, of clothes that were ordinary enough not to stand out. But when I try to fix his exact features in my mind, they slide. What remains solid is not his face, but his presence. And perhaps that is worse. A face can be remembered wrongly. A presence is harder to test. I picked up my sister's shoe, dragged her bike upright, and left. I did not speak to him. He did not speak to me. For years, that silence would matter more to me than any words could have. When we got home, my sister was already there, still upset, but no longer hysterical. Our parents asked what had happened. I told them she had fallen off her bike and run off like mad. I said it in the irritated, older sibling way I had then, trying to sound practical and unimpressed. Somewhere in the middle of explaining it, I mentioned the old man on the bench. I said it casually, as if it were an extra detail with no real importance. Something like, maybe he had a nice place to sit and draw out there, though I did not understand why he had picked that spot. My sister responded before our parents did. She said she did not care about the bench or the view. The words themselves were ordinary, but the tone was not. She spoke as if I had missed the point entirely. More than that, she spoke like someone confirming without meaning to that she had seen him too. She was not surprised by my mentioning him. She was angry at it. Angry, perhaps, because she had hoped not to hear him referred to aloud. Then my father asked what old man. At the time, I thought he was joking. Adults sometimes play dumb when children are upset, as if refusing to name a thing might reduce it. My mother looked confused as well, but not in a playful way. I remember looking from one parent to the other and feeling briefly that the room had gone off balance. My sister went quiet. Now I shrugged it off because that was easier than pressing the point. I assumed they had not noticed him or were trying not to make a fuss. The afternoon was swallowed by evening, and like so many strange moments in family life, it was never properly finished. It only stopped being discussed. Years later, after childhood had stretched and thinned and left certain memories standing out more clearly than others, that day in the woods came back to me. Not all at once. It returned in pieces. My sister's bike on the ground, the bench in the wrong place, my father asking, "What old man?" At some point I brought it up with him again, expecting him to smile and admit he had been teasing us. He did not smile. He remembered the day. He remembered my sister falling. He remembered her coming home shaken and dirty and crying harder than the scrape on her knee seemed to justify. He remembered me mentioning something about the woods, but he said, plainly and without hesitation, that there had been no old man there. He had thought at the time that I was exaggerating or muddling details in the way children sometimes do. He told me this in such a calm, matter-of-fact way that I felt embarrassed for having expected anything else. There was no performance in him, no trying to scare me. He was simply stating what he believed to be true. The force of that stayed with me because it did not fit with my memory at all. Memory can blur. It can soften edges and move things around. But there are some details you hold not because you rehearse them, but because they were the reason a moment fixed itself in the first place. My sister did not simply fall in the woods. She fell beside a bench where an old man sat drawing. Remove him, and the whole scene changes shape. A few years ago, long after all of us had grown up and moved into separate routines, I walked my dog through those same woods. I had not planned to think about any of this. The day was ordinary, overcast, the sort of afternoon when the light stays flat and colorless for hours. My dog pulled ahead now and then, nose low, absorbed in smells I could not detect. The path had changed in the small ways all places do over time. Some stretches seemed narrower, some trees looked larger than I remembered. But the body knows familiar ground even when the eye hesitates. I knew where I was. Without deciding to, I followed the route that should have led me to that spot. I found the bend. I found the stretch where the path dipped slightly and the undergrowth thickened on one side. I found the place where I was sure my sister had fallen. The certainty of it rose in me before I even stopped walking. And then almost at once, certainty turned into something colder. There was no bench. At first that meant very little. Benches get removed. Wood rots. Councils clear old furniture. People vandalize things. I stood there expecting to feel only mild disappointment, the kind that comes when memory reaches for an object no longer present. But what unsettled me was not the bench's absence. It was the ground itself. Trees stood where the bench should have been, not small trees that might have grown in afterward, not saplings, old trees thick at the base, with roots that rose from the earth in heavy ridges before sinking back down. The sort of roots that reshape soil over many years. The sort of roots you do not place a bench between and later forget. They occupied the exact area where that bench had stood in my memory, leaving no practical space for it now, or, as far as I could tell, at any point in the recent past. I walked up and down the path several times. I pulled slightly at the leash each time my dog tried to move on. I checked farther ahead, then farther back, trying to negotiate with my own mind. Maybe the bench had been 10 feet away, maybe 20. Maybe I had stitched one memory onto another and mistaken the location. But the more I looked, the worse the feeling became. The path was right, the bend was right, the trees were wrong only because they made my memory impossible. I stood there listening to the woods in the way people do when they are trying to calm themselves with facts. Wind in branches, a dog's collar giving a small metal click, dry leaves shifting, no mystery in any of it. And yet the ordinary sounds did not help. They only made the problem clearer. If I had remembered a bench where there had never been one, then why did the old man remain so vivid? Why did my sister react the way she had? Why had she seemed to know who I meant when I brought him up? Why had my mother and father, years before that, both arrived at the image of an old man without meaning to support each other? I tried every explanation that a reasonable person tries. A false memory, childhood distortion. A bench moved from another part of the woods and attached by time to the wrong place. A stranger seen elsewhere and later inserted into that afternoon because the story from my mother had lodged too deeply in me. Each explanation helped for a moment, then failed under its own weight. The trouble was not that one memory seemed odd. The trouble was that several moments spread over years leaned toward the same shape. Since that walk, the old man has never fully left me. I do not live in fear of him. I do not expect to turn a corner and find him waiting. That would almost be easier. Sudden fear burns hot and passes. What I carry is quieter than that. It is the discomfort of a thing that does not resolve. The feeling of a loose thread in the fabric of ordinary life that you cannot stop touching with your mind. Sometimes I think the worst part is how little happened. No one was attacked. No message was delivered. No curse followed us home. There was only a child screaming at a front door, a glimpse in a mirror, a man on a bench in the woods, a girl running in panic, and years later, a place that would not make room for what I remembered. That is all. And somehow that is enough. I still think about my sister's face when she got up from the ground. Not just pain, but alarm, as if she had seen something I had not, or understood something faster than I did. I think about the old man not looking up. I think about my father speaking years later with complete conviction, denying a figure I would have sworn had been as real as the trees around him. Most of all, I think about the drawing. If he was drawing, what was he drawing? The woods, the path, us, or something that did not belong to our version of that afternoon at all? There are times when I wonder whether some places keep impressions of people the way houses keep smells, not ghosts in the dramatic sense, something fainter and harder to prove. A presence that appears only under certain conditions to certain people, for reasons that remain hidden. The house where I grew up never gave us enough to claim anything. The woods never gave us enough either. All either place ever offered was a pattern, and patterns are dangerous because once you see one, you cannot go back to seeing isolated incidents. I do not know what the old man was. I do not know whether my cousin, my father, my sister, and I all brushed against the same thing over the course of years, or whether memory is more contagious than we like to admit. Maybe fear can shape itself around a family and pass from one person to another until it starts leaving marks that look like evidence. Maybe a child hears a story and unknowingly builds a future sighting out of it. Maybe the mind will always choose a face and age and human form when it stands before something it cannot explain. But I know this much. Whenever I think of that house, I eventually think of the front door. Whenever I think of the woods, I eventually think of the bend in the path where a bench should not have been and could not have been. And whenever that happens, I feel the same small change in the air around my thoughts, as though some part of me is stepping back into a place where the world looked normal and was not. What stays with me is not the idea that I saw a ghost. It is the possibility that something can enter a life so lightly that it leaves no proof at all, only agreement and disagreement, memory and denial, one person's certainty pressed against another's. It is the possibility that two people can stand in the same place, and one of them can see an old man sitting quietly with a sketchbook, while the other sees only trees. That thought has disturbed me far more than any clear haunting ever could, because it suggests that whatever happened did not need to break the world to make room for itself. It may have always been there, calm and patient, waiting to be noticed by whoever happened to be looking at the wrong moment. And sometimes, when the woods are still in the late afternoon and the light turns thin between the trunks, I think of him sitting there without surprise, as if he had expected us all along. I think of my cousin screaming at a door no one else could fill. I think of a reflection my father never wanted to describe twice. Then I picture those trees, their roots deep in the ground, older than my memory, older than the version of events I trusted, standing exactly where that bench could never have stood. That is the part that never loosens its grip. Not the old man himself, but the quiet certainty that something was wrong long before I knew how to name wrongness, and that whatever I saw or thought I saw did not vanish. It only withdrew, leaving behind the sort of unease that does not shout, does not fade, and does not need an answer to keep growing. I used to think horror only stayed on the screen. That night taught me how quickly it can follow you into the dark. Even now, years later, I still cannot say with complete confidence whether what happened was psychological, paranormal, or something in between. I only know that it was one of the worst nights of my life, and that it began with something as simple as sitting alone and pressing play. To explain what happened, I need to start with a habit I had for years. I was always the kind of person who watched horror-related content late at night. Exorcism cases, paranormal documentaries, disturbing recordings, real-life horror stories, anything that felt dark or unsettling. It had become normal for me. Most of the time, it never affected me for long. I would feel tense while watching, maybe a little creeped out afterward. But once the video ended, that was usually it. I would go to sleep, wake up the next morning, and move on with my life. That night felt different from the beginning, though I did not fully understand that until much later. It was around midnight. I was eating dinner alone, watching a full documentary about Annalise Michel. I had already heard about her case before, but only in the vague way most people know it. A name, a few disturbing details, a reputation that hangs around certain conversations about possession. This documentary went much deeper than anything I had seen before. It did not treat the case like a quick, creepy story. It showed everything. Her seizures, her voice, her family, the priests, the desperation around her, the recordings. It was not entertaining in the normal sense. It was heavy, oppressive. The kind of thing that leaves a residue in your mind even while you are still watching it. If you know anything about her case, then you know why it unsettles people so deeply. She was a young woman from Germany who began suffering seizures, hearing voices, and showing behavior her family believed was demonic possession. 2 priests eventually carried out dozens of exorcism sessions on her. There are real audio recordings from those sessions, and that is the part that got to me most. Those recordings do not sound like a horror film. They sound raw and wrong in a way that is hard to explain. The voices are deep. The screaming feels torn out of someone rather than performed. And the whole thing leaves you with the sense that you have listened to something you should not have heard. And I did not stop with the documentary. I also listened to the original tapes. Looking back, that feels like the moment the night changed. It sounds dramatic to say that now, but that is honestly how it feels in memory. Watching something disturbing is one thing. Listening to real recordings in the middle of the night, alone, is another. Those sounds stayed with me immediately. They got under my skin. Even after I turned everything off, the voices kept echoing in my head. The growling, the screaming, the strange rhythm of it. None of it sounded like something that should still exist once the speakers went quiet. By the time I finished everything, it was around 2:30 in the morning. I told myself I was just tired and overstimulated. I turned everything off and went to bed, thinking sleep would reset my mind. I remember lying there, trying not to replay the recordings, forcing myself to think about anything else. At some point, I drifted off. Then, around 3:30, I woke up. Not gradually. Not in the normal, confused way people wake from sleep. I opened my eyes instantly, fully alert, like something had pulled me straight out of unconsciousness. The room was dark and silent, but before I could even settle back down, I heard a loud sound come from the kitchen. It sounded like something had fallen, not a small creak. Not the kind of noise houses make at night. It was distinct, sharp, the sort of sound that makes your heart jump because it seems to demand an explanation. My first thought was that maybe something had slipped off a shelf. My second was that maybe a cat had somehow gotten inside. I did not have a good reason for either thought. I was just reaching for anything normal. For a few seconds, I stayed in bed, listening. Nothing. That was somehow worse. If the sound had continued, if something had moved again, I might have been able to place it. But the silence after it made the noise feel too deliberate, too singular. Eventually, curiosity mixed with fear, and that pushed me out of bed. I got up and walked toward the kitchen, already tense, already aware of how fast my heart was beating. Then I stepped inside. And the second I did, I felt it. The only word I have for it is pressure. It felt like something pressing down on my shoulder, not a hand in the clear, literal sense, not fingers I could identify, but unmistakable pressure, physical enough that my body reacted instantly. I froze right there in the doorway. It was not violent. It did not shove me. It was almost worse than that. It was controlled, firm, like something had touched me just enough to let me know it was there. I turned around immediately. There was no one behind me. That was the point where fear stopped being manageable. Until then, I could still tell myself I was reacting to a noise in the dark, a fallen object, a tired brain, an overactive imagination. But the feeling on my shoulder broke that calm explanation apart. It felt too physical, too immediate. My whole body went cold at once. I did not search the kitchen. I did not check the shelves. I did not inspect anything. I just ran back to my room, shut the door, got into bed, and pulled the blanket up like a child. I kept repeating the same thing to myself. This is just your mind. You watched something disturbing. You are tired. Nothing is real. I said those things over and over because I needed them to be true. Eventually, after what felt like a long time but was probably only 30 minutes, I must have drifted off again. Then I woke up a second time. This time, there was no sound, no crash, no warning. I simply opened my eyes, and the second I did, I swear I saw two faces right in front of mine. They were not across the room. They were not standing in a corner or peering from a doorway. They were close, far too close. So close it felt like they were almost pressing into me, like they were the reason I had woken up in the first place. I do not know how to describe them properly because the whole thing lasted only a moment, but that moment was enough. They looked dark, distorted, wrong, not like ordinary human faces seen badly in the dark. Something about them felt malformed, unnatural, like my mind could register them only as faces and horror at the same time. I could not move. My body locked up completely. My heart slammed so hard against my chest, I thought I might actually pass out. And in that exact moment, the exorcism voice I had listened to earlier replayed in my head so clearly that it felt less like memory and more like sound. It was as if the recordings had followed me into sleep and were waiting inside the dark for me to wake up to them. I do not know how long that lasted. A second can feel endless when you are that afraid. It might have been 1 second, it might have been 10. But when I finally broke out of it, I grabbed my phone immediately and turned on the flashlight. I needed light right away, any light. The darkness had become unbearable. I started scrolling through random videos, anything that had nothing to do with horror. I played my favorite songs. I let the screen brightness burn into my eyes if it meant I did not have to sit with silence. After a few minutes, I turned on the room light too because I needed to see every corner clearly. Eventually, my breathing slowed enough that I thought maybe I could calm down. Then my dog started vomiting. He had been completely fine earlier in the night, peacefully asleep. No signs of discomfort, no restlessness, nothing unusual at all. Then suddenly he was gagging and throwing up. I had to get out of bed again, clean everything, and check that he was okay. Under normal circumstances, it would have just been an unpleasant interruption, but by then my nerves were shredded. Every sound felt amplified. Every small movement in the room made me tense. The act of cleaning up after him felt surreal, like I was doing something ordinary in the middle of a night that had stopped feeling real. After I cleaned up, he stood there for a moment. Then he started barking. Not at me, not at the door, not at a window. He was barking into empty space. Low at first, then louder, stopping and starting again, as if something kept catching his attention. That was the part that frightened me most. More than the kitchen noise. More than the pressure on my shoulder. More than the faces. My dog never did that at night. He did not bark at nothing. And because I was already so badly shaken, the sight of him staring into apparently empty space and barking made everything inside me tighten. I tried to calm him. I told myself he was reacting to me, to my anxiety, no, to some normal sound outside that I could not hear. I kept forcing myself back toward logic because the alternative was too much. But even while I was trying to steady him, I heard something else from the kitchen. This time it was quieter, not another crash. More like a faint movement, A small shift, a whisper of sound, just enough to be noticed but not enough to identify. That somehow made it worse. Loud noises can be investigated. Quiet ones leave room for imagination to do the rest. I froze and listened. My dog tensed beside me and felt my blood go cold all over again. At that point, I had no desire to investigate anything. I stayed in my room with the lights on, my dog close to me, and my phone in my hand like it was some kind of protection. The room felt safer only because it was smaller and visible. Outside it, the rest of the house felt distant and wrong. The kitchen may as well have been another building. Every second dragged. I do not remember exactly how long I stayed awake after that. At some point, exhaustion won, because eventually I did fall asleep. Morning made everything look harmless again. The house was completely normal. The kitchen was quiet. Nothing was out of place. No object had fallen, no shelf was broken, nothing was on the floor. My dog was perfectly fine too, acting as if the night before had never happened. In a strange way, that normality made it worse. If I had found something broken in the kitchen, I could have attached the fear to it. If my dog had still been sick, I could have blamed his behavior on that. But there was nothing, no evidence, no explanation. Just the memory of a chain of events that had felt brutally real while they were happening. I replayed the night in my mind again and again. First, the loud sound in the kitchen, then the pressure on my shoulder, then waking up to those two faces inches from mine, then my dog vomiting, then barking into empty space, then the quiet sound from the kitchen again. None of it had happened in isolation. That was what bothered me most. It was not one strange moment I could dismiss as a dream or a single burst of panic. It was one thing after another, each event making the next one feel more believable and more frightening. And all of it had happened after listening to those recordings. That connection would not leave me alone. I am not the kind of person who blindly believes every paranormal story. I know what fear can do to the brain. I know anxiety can distort the way you interpret ordinary things. I know sleep paralysis exists. I know that overstimulation, especially late at night after watching disturbing material, can produce experiences that feel horrifyingly real. I told myself all of that over and over. This is just your mind. This is just your mind. Nothing is real. That explanation makes sense. It is the safest explanation too. But even now, I cannot fit every part of the night neatly inside it. I can understand the possibility of waking suddenly after listening to disturbing audio. I can understand how fear might make me misinterpret shadows, sounds, or the edges of sleep. I can even imagine that the faces were some brief sleep-related hallucination. But then my mind goes back to the pressure on my shoulder. It goes back to my dog. It goes back to how each thing seemed to escalate the next instead of fading away. That is the part that keeps the doubt alive. Sometimes I think maybe my mind was simply primed for terror in a way it had never been before. Maybe the documentary and those recordings pushed me farther than I realized. Maybe I was so tense that my body woke at every small sound, and once fear took hold, every ordinary event became charged with meaning. Maybe my dog vomited for a completely unrelated reason, and his barking had nothing to do with what I thought was happening. Maybe all of it can be explained if you strip away the emotion. I want to believe that. I really do. But memory is stubborn, especially when fear is involved. What I remember most clearly is not just being scared. It is how physical the whole night felt. The pressure on my shoulder. The violent way I woke up. The pounding in my chest. The sick certainty that something was building around me in the dark. The feeling that the line between what was in my head and what was in the room had become dangerously thin. That is why the night stayed with me. It did not feel like a simple nightmare. It did not feel like one isolated incident. It felt like a chain, like something had started and then kept unfolding in stages. That structure gave it a kind of logic that made it harder to dismiss. If it had only been the faces, I might have filed it away under sleep paralysis and moved on. If it had only been the kitchen noise, I might have blamed the house. If it had only been the dog, I might have blamed his stomach, but all of it together created something heavier. Sometimes I still wonder whether listening to those recordings was a mistake in a deeper sense. Not because I fully believe I invited something supernatural into my home, but because some things affect the mind so strongly that they alter the way you experience reality afterward. Maybe that is all haunting is sometimes. Not a demon in the room, but an idea so disturbing it begins to live inside you, shaping what you hear, what you see, what you fear. That thought makes more sense to me than the wildest paranormal explanation, and yet it is disturbing in its own way. I do not know if you can invite something in just by listening. I do not know if what happened was all coincidence. I do not know whether the line I crossed that night was spiritual or psychological. All I know is that the night felt different from anything I had experienced before or since. It felt oppressive from the inside. It felt like my own home had turned unfamiliar for a few hours. It felt like something terrible was standing just outside the edge of reason, close enough to be felt but never clearly seen. It felt like hell. And even now, years later, I am careful about what I watch late at night. Some things do not end when the screen goes black. Some sounds stay in your head longer than they should. Some stories leave a residue that sleep does not wash away, and some nights remind you just how thin the line really is between imagination, fear, and something you never want to meet in the dark.